Your phone battery used to last all day. Now, 2 years in, it's dead by 3 p.m., and you find yourself wondering, almost idly, whether it's time for a new one. Your blender's motor starts smelling faintly of something burning right around the 3-year mark. The printer, the one that worked perfectly last month, suddenly refuses to print at all, insisting a cartridge that's still half full is empty. The washing machine's drum bearing goes right after the warranty runs out, almost to the week, and the repair quote from the technician comes back suspiciously close to the price of buying a new one outright. None of these things happen exactly when you'd expect a random part failure. They happen right around the time a company would prefer you buy something new. That timing genuinely isn't a coincidence, and it isn't your imagination either. It has a name, a history, and in some cases, an actual paper trail. So here's the real question worth asking, and it's not the conspiracy theory version. Not, are companies secretly sabotaging my stuff? Because that framing makes it too easy to dismiss, and too easy for a company to truthfully deny. Since almost nobody actually sits in a room signing off on a memo titled, "Make this break sooner." The real question is, what would it actually mean, financially, for a company to build something that never breaks, never needs replacing, and never gives them a reason to sell you anything ever again? Once you understand the answer, you'll start noticing exactly how many products in your home were never designed to last as long as they possibly could, and exactly how much quiet engineering effort went into products that instead last just long enough. In 1932, a real estate broker named Bernard London published a pamphlet with a genuinely startling proposal, written in the depths of the Great Depression. His argument was straightforward and, in his own mind, humane. Products should be assigned a legally mandated expiration date, London argued, after which they would be officially deemed dead and required to be turned in and destroyed. His reasoning was that this would force continuous consumption, continuous manufacturing, and continuous employment, dragging the economy back out of collapse through sheer forced obsolescence. Bernard London's proposal was never adopted as law, and it's worth remembering he framed it as economic rescue, not corporate profit, a very different motive than what followed. But the term he helped popularize, planned obsolescence, didn't disappear along with the pamphlet. It just stopped being a public policy proposal anyone had to defend in front of voters, and quietly became a private business strategy instead, one nobody had to vote on or admit to. Picture a boardroom in Geneva in the winter of 1924. Representatives from the world's largest light bulb manufacturers, Osram, Philips, General Electric, and others, gather to form what would later become known as the Phoebus Cartel. Their stated purpose was standardization, a reasonable-sounding goal for an industry with wildly inconsistent products across different countries. Their actual purpose, documented in surviving cartel records and later examined extensively by historians, was to fix the maximum lifespan of a standard incandescent light bulb at exactly 1,000 hours, down from the 1,500 to 2,500 hours bulbs had commonly achieved before the agreement. Member companies that produced bulbs lasting longer than the agreed limit were fined for the violation, the same way a factory might be fined today for producing below a quality floor, except inverted, penalizing durability instead of rewarding it. The cartel operated for roughly 15 years, and its influence on the design and expected lifespan of light bulbs persisted for decades after it formally dissolved under the pressure of the Second World War. Historian Giles Slade, whose book Made to Break traces the history of obsolescence in American manufacturing, has pointed to the Phoebus Cartel as one of the earliest and most explicitly documented cases of an entire industry deliberately engineering a shorter product lifespan, not as a side effect of cost-cutting, but as the literal, stated goal of a signed agreement between competitors who otherwise fought each other for market share on every other front. There's a light bulb burning in a fire station in Livermore, California, right now, that has been continuously lit since 1901. It's outlasted the Phoebus Cartel, the companies that founded it, and roughly 1,000 other light bulbs installed and replaced around it over the last century. Nobody engineered that bulb to be remarkable. It's simply a bulb made before anyone had a financial incentive to make it worse. By 1960, the pattern had become visible enough that a journalist named Vance Packard wrote an entire book about it, The Waste Makers, examining how American manufacturers across dozens of industries were deliberately engineering shorter product lifespans and manufacturing a sense of constant fashionable inadequacy around products that still worked perfectly well. Packard drew a distinction that's still useful today between what he called obsolescence of function, a product that genuinely stops working, and obsolescence of desirability, a product that still works fine but has been made to feel outdated, unfashionable, or embarrassing to keep using. The second category, Packard argued, was in many ways more profitable and far easier to engineer than the first because it didn't require any actual mechanical failure at all, just a new model, a new look, and a carefully cultivated sense that what you already owned wasn't good enough anymore. Packard didn't invent that observation from nothing. He was describing a strategy that had already been running successfully for decades, pioneered not by a fringe theorist, but by one of the most respected executives in American business history. In the 1920s, Alfred P. Sloan, then president of General Motors, faced a genuine competitive problem. Henry Ford's Model T was cheap, durable, and mechanically unchanging, built to run for years with minimal alteration, and it dominated the market precisely because of that reliability. Sloan's solution, later described by business historians as dynamic obsolescence, was to introduce annual model year changes, new colors, new styling, new features, released on a yearly cycle regardless of whether the underlying mechanics of the previous year's car had any real deficiency at all. The strategy worked spectacularly. By the late 1920s, General Motors had overtaken Ford's market share, not by building a more reliable car, but by making last year's perfectly functional car feel visibly, socially out of date. Sloan himself was candid about the reasoning in his own later writings, describing the goal plainly as creating a certain amount of dissatisfaction with past models as compared with the new one. Ford eventually adopted the same annual refresh strategy simply to survive in the completely different kind of market Sloan had reshaped around him. Within a generation, the entire American auto industry had quietly and almost completely shifted from competing on durability to competing on novelty, and few other major industries have deviated from that same basic playbook since. Now picture something far more recent and far more directly verifiable than a 1920s cartel agreement or an executive's old memoir. In December 2017, Apple publicly admitted that it had been deliberately slowing down the processors in older iPhone models through a software update, officially explained as a measure to prevent unexpected shutdowns in phones with aging batteries. Users had spent months speculating online about why their older phones suddenly felt sluggish right around the time a new model launched, and the admission confirmed that the suspicion, dismissed by some as paranoia at the time, had been substantially correct. The admission triggered a wave of lawsuits, congressional inquiries, and government investigations across multiple countries, from consumer protection agencies in South Korea to regulators in Italy and France. In 2020, Apple agreed to pay up to $500 million to settle a class action lawsuit in the United States over the practice, and separately paid a $25 million fine to French regulators, who had opened their own investigation under the country's specific laws against planned obsolescence, among the strictest consumer protection statutes of their kind anywhere in the world. Apple maintained throughout that the slowdown was intended to protect device longevity, not shorten it. Regulators in multiple jurisdictions concluded that regardless of the stated intention, the company had failed to properly disclose what it was doing to the customers whose phones were quietly being throttled, and the financial impact, whether intended or not, nudged millions of users toward buying new phones sooner than they otherwise might have. Think about the design choices this kind of case reveals across the wider industry. Printer manufacturers have faced repeated legal action and public criticism over chips embedded in ink cartridges that report themselves as empty, while genuinely usable ink still remains inside, sometimes by a significant margin. Kyle Wiens, the founder of iFixit, an organization built around documenting and defending people's ability to repair their own devices, has spent years publicly cataloging design choices across industries that appear to prioritize replacement over repairability. Batteries glued rather than screwed into place, proprietary screws that require specialized tools nobody but the manufacturer owns, repair manuals that are simply never published at all. Weens has argued consistently that these choices are rarely framed internally as, let's make this break sooner. They're framed instead as manufacturing efficiency, design elegance, or intellectual property protection, decisions that happen to have the side effect, whether intended or not, of making a broken device more likely to be replaced than repaired. The same underlying pattern shows up somewhere you might not expect, far from circuit boards and lithium batteries entirely: your closet. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a research organization focused on the circular economy, published a widely cited 2017 report examining the global garment industry, and found that the average number of times a single garment gets worn before being discarded had fallen by roughly 36% compared to just 15 years earlier, even as global clothing production had roughly doubled over the same period. The report's authors were careful to note that this wasn't primarily driven by clothes physically falling apart faster, though cheaper construction and materials played some role. It was driven overwhelmingly by what the fashion industry itself openly calls fast fashion, a business model built around rapid style turnover, deliberately compressing what used to be 2 or 4 seasonal collections a year into as many as 50 or more micro-seasons, each one quietly signaling that last month's perfectly wearable clothing is now, subtly, out of step. It's Alfred Sloan's annual model change again, just measured in weeks instead of years, and applied to something considerably cheaper to keep replacing than a car. Now picture something smaller and far more human and personal than a corporate boardroom or a class-action courtroom. A man in his 60s sits at a folding table in a community hall on a Saturday morning, fluorescent light humming overhead, the smell of instant coffee drifting from a table near the door, a toaster in front of him with its bottom panel removed, wires and a small circuit board exposed. Around him, a dozen other tables host similar scenes: people leaning over broken kettles, lamps, sewing machines, and a small child's toy robot missing one arm. Volunteers with soldering irons and reading glasses moving between them offering advice, occasionally crouching down to explain a fix in plain language rather than simply doing it for the owner. This is a repair cafe, a model started in Amsterdam in 2009 by a woman named Martine Postma, who was frustrated by how much perfectly salvageable material she saw discarded simply because nobody nearby knew how, or was allowed, to fix it. The movement has since spread to thousands of similar gatherings worldwide, entirely volunteer-run, built on a simple, almost old-fashioned premise: that most broken things want to be fixed, not replaced, and that the knowledge to fix them has never actually disappeared, just been made increasingly difficult to access on purpose. The man with the toaster leaves 2 hours later, his machine working again, having spent nothing but a Saturday morning in the quiet, satisfying company of strangers solving the same small problem together, and a volunteer he's never met before shakes his hand like they've just won something. That scene captures something the corporate history doesn't fully explain on its own, no matter how many lawsuits or cartel documents get uncovered. Planned obsolescence isn't just a financial strategy imposed from above by executives in a boardroom. It's also a slow erosion of a skill and a relationship people used to have with their own possessions. The basic expectation that a thing you owned was yours to open, understand, and repair. Somewhere between the Phoebus Cartel's boardroom in 1924 and the glued-shut, tool-resistant battery compartment in the phone sitting in your pocket right now, that expectation quietly became something companies could design out of a product entirely, one sealed casing and discontinued repair manual at a time. This has, in recent years, produced a genuine legal and political backlash. What's often called the right to repair movement has pushed for legislation in multiple countries and U.S. states requiring manufacturers to make replacement parts, tools, and repair documentation available to consumers and independent repair shops, not just to the manufacturer's own authorized service centers. Several U.S. states have passed right to repair laws in recent years covering electronics, and the European Union has moved forward with its own directives requiring longer minimum support periods and easier access to spare parts for a range of consumer devices. Repair advocate Louis Rossman, who runs an independent electronics repair shop in New York and has testified before state legislatures on the issue, has argued publicly and repeatedly that the core problem isn't any single broken product, but a pattern across the entire electronics industry of designing repairability out of devices at the exact same rate that repair knowledge has become more freely available online, a kind of quiet arms race between manufacturers and the people trying to keep their own belongings alive a little longer. So when you put all of this together, a pattern emerges that spans a full century, from a Depression-era pamphlet nobody enacted, to a light bulb cartel that fined its own members for making bulbs too well, to an auto executive who openly wrote about manufacturing dissatisfaction with a perfectly good car, to a software update that quietly slowed down phones already sitting in people's pockets. A perfect product, one that never breaks, never wears out, and never gives its owner a reason to buy a replacement, isn't a manufacturing failure waiting to happen. In a business built on repeat purchases, it's closer to a worst-case scenario, a product so well-made it eventually stops generating revenue entirely. That doesn't mean every company is secretly plotting your blender's failure in a smoke-filled room. And it doesn't mean every design decision that shortens a product's life was made maliciously. Much of it happens quietly, in cost-cutting decisions, in styling trade-offs, in the simple absence of any incentive strong enough to justify building something that outlives its own profitability. But the light bulb burning in that California fire station since 1901 is proof that the alternative was always technically possible. Somebody just had to decide, at some point along the way, that it was worth less than the alternative. The next time something in your home breaks right around the moment its warranty runs out, that timing isn't necessarily a plot against you specifically, cooked up with your name in mind. It's the quiet, accumulated result of 100 years of decisions, made by people who mostly never met you and never will, about exactly how long something you own is allowed to last before it stops being useful to someone else's balance sheet, and how much easier that decision becomes when nobody outside a courtroom or a cartel's private minutes ever finds out it was made at all. If topics like this are your kind of rabbit hole, this channel exists for exactly this. The hidden systems still running underneath modern life, explained through the people who actually documented them, argued against them, or spent a Saturday morning quietly undoing them one toaster at a time. See you in the next